Let's start with one of the most simple and straightforward changes in ES6, which is the two new ways of declaring variables, which are going to replace the var declarations that we've been using so far. And these are let and const. So this is the starter project for this section that you can download from the course from this section as always. So we will continue with our persons examples throughout this section, since we're already familiar with these. And don't worry about these colored boxes here on the right side. We're just going to need them for some examples later on, okay? So how do we use let and const? First of all, in all of the lectures during this section, I will usually start by writing some code in ES5 and then show you how to do it in ES6 and where the big differences are. So let's do that. Let me just start by writing that this lecture is about let and const. Okay, so I'm going to start with the ES5 code, okay? And let's just say we want to declare a name. And we've done that a lot of times, so we already know we use var in ES5 and the name. And I will call it name5 because this one is for ES5, and then later I'm going to use name6, okay? Because we cannot duplicate these names, so we need two different variable names. So Jane Smith, and let's say her age is 23, and we then change that name to Jane Miller. So imagine that Jane married someone with the last name of Miller. So we can simply mutate this name variable here, right? So let's console log this. And you will understand why I'm doing this in a second, okay? So let's console log this and see what happens. And of course, we see Jane Miller here. Alright, so let's now write the same thing in ES6. So instead of var, we can now choose between const and let. And const is for constants, which means for values that we don't want to change, and let is like the old var. So this is for values that we actually want to change or mutate later on. So let's declare the name as a constant. And so we use const name, and I'm calling it name6 for ES6. And I'm going to call her again Jane Smith. And now the age. And since we know that the age can change, we're going to use let, right? So now Jane is 23, but next year she's going to be 24, 25, and so on. So this is something that can mutate, and so we use let. So age 6, 23. All right. Let's now suppose again that Jane wants to marry and change her name. So if we now say name 6 should be Jane Miller, and then console.log the result of that, such as we did before, let's see what's going to happen. So we get an error here, assignment to constant variable. And that makes sense, right? Because as I said, this const keyword here is used to declare constants, so variables that are immutable, which we cannot change. And if we then attempt to change the value of a constant, it gives us this error here. Okay, so again, in ES6 we no longer use var, but instead we use const if we have a variable that's not going to change its value over time, and we use let if we want to change the value of the variable. So we now have a way to declare constants. But that's not the only thing that's new with let and const. And that's because variables declared with var in ES5 are function scoped, but variables declared with let and const in ES6 are block scoped. Alright, so function scoped and block scoped. And that's a huge difference. So let's see what that actually means with a new example. So I'm now going to write a simple driver's license function, okay? So just that we have something different here. And I'm going to start again with ES5. So function driver's license. And we are going to do something if the person passed a test. Okay? So we say if passed test, then the first name is John, and that's actually not right. And the year of birth is 1990. And then we want to console log this. Okay, so this may not be the most realistic example really, but this is just to show you something, and you will see in a second when we write the ES6 code. Okay, so don't worry. So now let me just console log this. First name, let's say born in, and of course year of birth. Is now officially allowed to drive a car. So let's call this function actually. And we say that the person passed the test, so we passed true into the function. And let's see what happens. Okay, first we of course have to comment out this part of the code here so that it doesn't get in our way. Okay, and now of course this printed out to the console just right. So let's now do the same function for ES6. Let me just change this here to 5. And then I'm going to copy it. And here's also 5. ES6. And 6. And 6. Okay. Here we can use a let instead of a var. Okay, because let's assume that the first name can also change. So let can be a good change here. And then for the birth year, of course, that cannot change, right? It's impossible that you change your birth year. So this will be a constant. And now, of course, if we print it to the console, it will work, right? But now it's time to see why let and const are different from var. So let's change this line here, where we actually use these variables first name and year of birth out of the if statement. Okay, and put them here. And then do the same thing in here. All right. And let's see what happens right now. Okay, so we get an error here in line 41, which is this one. So the first one worked just fine. This console log of course worked because we can use the first name and year of birth variables here in the same driver's license function, right? But in here, it's different. We get an error saying that first name is not defined, which is strange, right? But that's because with let and const, the variables are not function scoped, but block scoped. So what is a block? A block is simply all the code that is wrapped between these curly braces here. So each time that we have an if statement or a for block or a while block, we're actually creating a new block. And the variables declared with let and const are only valid, are only accessible by the code that are inside of the same block. So if we move outside of the block, which is what we did here, then we no longer have access to these variables that are here. So this is similar to what we had before with functions, right? So with the var keyword, it works differently. We have access if it's in the same function, right? If we now moved out this console log to outside of the function, then it would also no longer work. Because the variables declared with var, as we learned throughout this course, are only accessible inside of a function, but not from the outside. So this is not going to work, right? So we have this error here. So let's move this back. and come back here. So this really is a bit different from what we were used to do up until this point, right? So again, we now no longer have access to the variables created inside of a block, which is this one here in this case, because these variables are now block scoped and no longer function scoped. So suppose we wanted to use these variables here outside of the block, then we would just do it the way that before we did it with functions. So we can declare these variables outside of the block, which before we did outside of the function, and then define the variables in here. So let's say first name and const year of birth. And so now in here we can simply define them and then it should work. Or does it? Because actually this also does not work. It only works for the let declarations. So we simply cannot define a constant here in a block and then use it outside of that block. If we really want to use this constant outside of the block, then we have to declare the constant out here. And then of course it's gonna work. So now it works again. So we declared the first name variable here outside of the block, but didn't define its value, and then define it in here. And that's why we can then use the first name variable outside of the block, which is the exact same thing that we used to do with functions before, right? So this really is a huge difference between what we had before. But that's not even all. Suppose we would use a variable here before we actually declare it. So let's say we say console.log of the first name. So do you remember what this is going to print out to the console? And I really hope that you do. And alright, it's undefined. And that's because in an execution context, all variables are hoisted and set to undefined, right? And so if we then use them like this before we actually declare and define them, we get undefined. Now in here, it doesn't work quite like that. So let's say we wanted to use the first name variable in here. So let's see what that gives us. And now we get a first name is not defined error. So now we can effectively not use a variable before it was really declared. And I actually think this is a good thing because it may prevent some errors. Now this happens because of something called the temporal dead zone, which basically just means that the variables are actually hoisted, but we still cannot access them before they are declared. So this is just a technical term, but what you need to know is that we can only use a variable after we actually declared and defined it. Okay, and just to finish this, let's just take a look at maybe a bit more practical example, all right? So let's say that in our code, we were using an I variable, okay? So let I be, let's say 23. So this was just a normal variable that we were using in our code, okay? And now suppose we have a for loop, okay? And we usually declare a variable in here, which is a counter called I, right? So I was the variable that we used all the time, so let's also use it here. So we say I start at 0, and it should go on before I equals 5. So as long as I is less than 5, and then I should be incremented. So this is all nothing new for you, right? And then we just console log all of the i's. Okay, and then after that, we also console.log I out here. Remember, which is the variable that we had up here, all right? And before we can run this, let me just get rid of this line so that we don't have that error. And so let's see. Okay, so we have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, which are these console logs, and then I is 23. So assigning other values to I in here, in this for loop, doesn't change the I variable that we had defined here with the let. And again, that's because these variables are block scoped. And so this I variable here is a completely different variable from this one. So they happen to have the same name, but it really doesn't matter because they are separate variables. It's like having var I inside of a function and var I outside of a function. So these would be also two completely different variables, right? And now here with the block in ES6, it's exactly what happens as well. So I here is a completely different variable in this block than this I here in this other, let's say, block. So if we had var instead, let's just very quickly test this out. What do you think would I be? And that's right, it would be 5. Because these variables are of course not block scoped. So this is now not a different variable. And so this 23 here will be overwritten, and then in the end we have the final I from this counter variable here. So I really hope this makes sense and that you understood the main differences between var, const, and let. Okay? So as a conclusion of this lecture, if you want to start using ES6, then the best practice is actually to use let for variables that will change their value over time, and const for variables that cannot be reassigned, so they are constant throughout our code.